Hello, and thank you for joining this presentation of Building Empathy Through Stories of Crisis with Professors Peter Hein, Laura Otis, and Miriam Udell. I'm Katie Bush, the Executive Director of International Advancement and Constituent Engagement here at Emory, and delighted to be co-hosting this program with Emory's networks in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland, along with the Emory Halle Institute for Global Research. Before I introduce our moderator for today's program, I want to share that this is being recorded and will be made available on the Emory Collective website and our YouTube channel for future viewing. During the presentation, if you have a question for one of our speakers, please put it in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform to be addressed at the end. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Lesser, Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of History and Emory's Director of the Halle Institute for Global Research. A specialist in Brazilian studies and author of numerous prize-winning books and articles, Professor Lesser's current research focuses on immigration and health in Brazil. Thank you for your time facilitating today's discussion, Jeff, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Katie. It's wonderful to be here for yet another event in partnership with the Office of International Advancement and Constituent Engagement, and I want to add my thanks to the Austria, Germany, and Switzerland networks of the Emory Alumni Association. The Halle Institute for Global Research supports and promotes global research opportunities for faculty, students, and visiting scholars that range from creating digital historical maps to exploring whether reprogramming common somatic cells will provide a viable alternative to stem cells. Over the past year, the Halle Institute has made Germany one of its areas of research focus, both because of the many researchers from Emory who conduct research in Germany and about Germany. This webinar comes in the context of two exciting new initiatives: the Halle Institute's Collaborative Research Grant Program with the University of Bonn, and another one co-funded with the Halle Foundation of Atlanta, which opens up Emory's collaborative research to scholars from anywhere in Germany. We're particularly pleased that joining us today is Kelly Richmond Yates, the Halle Institute's Associate Director, who is the winner of grants from the DAAD and the German Fulbright Commission. And her work directly with Germany has strengthened our broad networks, including with the DFG and the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Today, we are thrilled to have presentations from three of Emory's leading faculty members who will discuss how writers can stimulate readers' imaginations so that readers can connect emotionally with people who are different than themselves. I'll introduce all three right now. First is Dr. Miriam Udell. She is an associate professor of German studies and Jewish studies, where her teaching focuses on Yiddish language, literature, and culture. She holds an AB in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from Harvard University and a PhD in comparative literature from the same institution. She was ordained in 2019 as part of the first cohort of the executive ordination tract at the Yeshivat Maharat, a program designed to bring qualified mid-career women into the Orthodox Jewish rabbinate. Dr. Udell's academic research interests include 20th century Yiddish literature and culture, Jewish children's literature, and American Jewish literature. She is the author of Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque, winner of the 2017 National Jewish Book Award in Modern Jewish Thought and Experience, and Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature, which was published by New York University Press just in October of this year. Our second speaker, Dr. Peter Hein, studied Germanistic and European history in Bonn and Siegen, and continued his studies in German literature at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, where he received his PhD in 1994. After many years at the University of Tennessee, he joined the faculty of the German Studies Department at Emory's College of Arts and Sciences in 2005. He has been awarded numerous research grants, including as a Fulbright Senior Research Fellow in Vienna. He focuses on German literature and culture since 1750, and his interests revolve around three distinct areas. Geographically, his research tilts towards cultural creations emanating from Austria. Topically, he pursues the work of assimilated German Jewish figures. And finally, he studies the interaction between literature and classical music, which is especially evident in his current research on Beethoven's intellectual interests. Recently, he rediscovered his research on German Jewish cultural history, especially by focusing on two novels by Austro-German Jews that critique anti-Black racism in the United States during the time of Jim Crow. And finally, our first speaker for the evening, or for the afternoon here, will be Laura Otis. She is a professor of English at Emory University. With a Bachelor of Science in Biochemistry, an MA in Neuroscience, and a PhD in Comparative Literature, and an MFA in Fiction, she compares the creative thinking of scientific and literary writers. Dr. Otis is the author of many interdisciplinary books, including Organic Memory, Membranes and Networking, Mueller's Lab, Rethinking Thought, and Banned Emotions, and she is also the author of the novels Clean, Refiner's Fire, Lacking in Substance, and The Tantalus Letters. She has translated Santiago Ramon y Cajal's Vacation Stories and edited Literature and Science in the 19th century. For her creative interdisciplinary studies in literature and science, Dr. Otis received a MacArthur Fellowship in 2000. So it's now my pleasure to turn the event over to our speakers, and we will start with Dr. Otis. The floor is yours. Or we'll start with Dr. Höyng. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for the kind introduction, and Katie for having this wonderful opportunity to share some of my research with you. Before doing so, I'll say to everyone who is attending this event, Guten Abend and Grüß Gott. So I want to share with you the discovery of two novels. It's one part of my research, and you see in this PowerPoint here, basically the titles of these in English. The Hugo Bettau's The Blue Stain, published in 1922, and Arthur Run's Marilyn in 1928. And now comes, I wish I could forward this to the next slide, but it's okay. Now we go, let's see, there we go. I'm not going to, in my 9 minutes left, going to tell you now all the slides, and you can look at it while I talk about my research. When I started this research, it started with Hugo Bettauer, who wrote a best-selling novel in 1922 called Die Stadt ohne Juden, ein Roman von übermorgen. The City Without Jews, a novel of the day after tomorrow. It was a bestseller back then, not only in Germany and Austria, but also in the United States when it was translated in 1926. In this novel, Bettauer addressed basically the anti-Semitism that was increasing after the downfall of the Habsburg Empire at the end of the World War I. And this novel was basically an argument he is making that if the Jews had to leave Vienna in particular, then Austria would be deprived economically, culturally, and politically. It is an interesting novel, historically speaking, and when I started the project, I thought, okay, I need to know more who this forgotten author is. And he published about 22 different novels, and then I looked up what these novels were about, a lot of them serial novels, and I did my share of research on them, and then I found a novel called Das Blaue Mal. Here you see, Das Blaue Mal. And that when you see this in German, you don't think much about it, so it didn't mean much when I saw the title. only when I saw a little annotation saying this novel takes place also in Georgia and Vienna. In Atlanta, it ends in Atlanta. And then I thought, wait a second, a novel that plays in Vienna and Atlanta, I need to read this. I need to know what this is about. And it was a fascinating reading from page 1 to the very end. It's really a page turner, I have to say. And it is fascinating how Bettauer, in the same year that he addressed the anti-Semitism in his home country, Vienna and Austria, that he also made a strong plea basically for the Blacks in the United States and fighting racism in the United States. For the protagonist is a child of mixed race, and he grows, first he's born, he's conceived, I should say, at Piedmont Park here in Atlanta. Then he is born in New York and then will be raised as a young adult in Vienna, and only through circumstances ends up being back in New York and faces for the first time as a young man, basically racism, and is seen as Black. And he fights that. He doesn't want to be seen as Black. And only through more circumstances, highly unusual circumstances, and I should say, if I had more time, this novel is topsy-turvy as much as Bettauer's own biography is just mind-boggling, because he lived in Austria, came to the United States, moved back to Austria, back to the States, and so on. So this novel is truly amazing, for it ends in Atlanta during the race riots in 1906. And finally, the protagonist at the very end basically agrees that he is one of them, one of the African Americans, and will join the early civil rights movement of the 20th century, will join the NAACP, and will fight for more rights for African Americans, because he had witnessed firsthand what it means to be discriminated against as a Black, as seen as a Black person. So it's a stunning novel. When I did this, I thought, well, this is, historically speaking, interesting. After all, I'm a scholar of German literature and German cultural history. And I thought, well, this is adding something. But in light of what happened in the last few months in this country, it is really bringing to the forefront how deep racism is ingrained in the US society. These names that you have learned, George Floyd in Minneapolis, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, and Ahmaud Arbery here in Georgia, all faced a degree of racism, of brutality, of murdering that is shocking, disturbing, and frankly, something that we need to do something against as much as we can. And so my research all of a sudden has become more relevant than I wish it would be the case. This also applies to the next novel that I discovered recently, and that is by Arthur Rund. He's even less known than Hugo Bettauer, and he, like Bettauer, was an assimilated Jewish writer and traveled to the United States, first time in 1924, 1925, wrote a book about a travel log called Amerika ist anders, America is different, and then 2 years later published a novel called Maryland. What is interesting, this is from the Amerika ist anders, what is interesting about this novel is that it's strikingly different in style, in tone, from Bettauer. Bettauer's novel is, as I mentioned, topsy-turvy, melodramatic to the last page, when of course there are love stories, there's eroticism, there's crime, there's a duel, there's lynching. I mean, there's so much going on. Maryland is almost the complete opposite, in that is, you read the novel 2/3 into it and you start wondering, what is it really about? Why am I supposed to read this? Life of a young couple. She's first in Chicago, they eventually move to New York, and they live their daily lives. She's always a little bit hesitant against Philip, her husband, to push so hard for founding a family and then having a child. But you start wondering, why do I all need to know this? until it really hits you in the last third, when finally there is a child and it's born and she gives birth, Marilyn, to a young girl. And she obviously has features that mark her as Black for some. And it comes a big shock. And she knew it all along and sensed, and we sensed her hesitation towards her husband of having a family. And she faces all of a sudden now in New York a form of racism, first by her husband, by the friends of her husband, and a divorce, so that she returns to her maternal ancestry to a Caribbean island, where she wants to have her child raised by her cousins and uncle, but she ends tragically and commits suicide. So these novels both address racism in the United States, that unfortunately is not any longer historical relevant, but rather gives us in 2020 or soon 2021, a sense of how much it is ingrained, this form of racism in the United States, particularly against Blacks, and how two European authors had a sensitivity to pick up on that. Let me finish briefly. They picked up on it because they themselves, as Jews, knew very well what racism looks like. They knew that forms of discrimination, they experienced it firsthand, meant to them, and therefore were very sensitive when they came to the United States, picking up and seeing that and witnessing it. I should say that Rund, when he escaped Nazi Austria in 1938, came to New York and shortly after, unfortunately, died in 1939. Thank you for having time for this. And now I give it over to Laura.
Hello, thank you, Peter. And I'd also like to say to everyone, schönen guten Abend. I'm very happy that you could be here. All right, I'm going to try to advance the slide. Not advancing. Try one more time. There we go. Okay, so just very briefly, this is my life in two pictures. In 1986, a large change took place when I moved from the lab to a more literary world. All right, the starting point for what I'd like to discuss tonight is how human brains integrate sensory information from 5 different sensory modalities. We're seeing, hearing, smelling, doing other things all at the same time. And we take it for granted that they're integrated into a sense of one experience. But for neuroscientists, it's by no means a trivial question how this happens, because all of this different sensory information is processed or interpreted, compared with other things in different brain regions, sometimes even at different speeds. So how do we put it together to get a sense of one experience? Okay, so the central idea of my current project is that I think the scientists could learn a lot from the experts in this area who are creative writers, especially fiction writers, who excel at creating illusions that feel real from a sensory point of view. Master writers or very skilled creative writers are able to stimulate people to imagine hearing, smelling, seeing all at once, so that it never even arises as a question how these are happening simultaneously, even though language is moving forward serially in time. So how do they do this with language? The reason that I'm raising this question is that we're in a historical moment where it's crucial that we understand each other, that we're able to feel each other's experiences so that they feel real. And I think the way to do this is to think about how creative writers are able to do it, which is to tell your story so that other people can feel what you feel. In terms of senses as well as emotions, because I believe that sensory experience helps to make emotional experience accessible. All right, so Flannery O'Connor, who comes from Georgia, who lived from not too far away from where we're speaking, reminds people that fiction, sort of the guts of fiction, is really about sensory perception. If you make abstract statements, it's not going to get readers very excited. If you say she was sad, that's not going to do much for anybody. But if you say she felt as though the world was melting, she felt as though her face was falling apart, that's going to have a very different sort of effect. It's to help readers understand what a character is feeling emotionally. You've got to give a sense of what that character is feeling in all of her sensations at once. Okay, so O'Connor said that she learned from a friend who was quoting Gustave Flaubert that to make a description of anything feel real, you've got to give a reader 3 senses at once. Let's say, well, not at once, say within a paragraph. If you're putting a reader in a barn, you've got to say not just what that barn looks like, but what it sounds like, what it smells like, how a voice sounds echoing off a wall. That you've got to construct it with several different senses. Okay, so some of the things that neuroscientists studying sensory integration might ask writers, well, how can you use language to do this? What sensory modalities are most often combined? Are there particular pairs of them? Vision and touch turns out to be one that occur with particular frequency. What combinations work well to draw people into characters' minds, and what makes a literary description memorable? What makes a literary description stick in your mind? If you read a novel of several hundred pages, what do you remember of that novel, say a day later or 10 years later? Well, one way that writers do it is through individual word choice. If you think about words like soft or crisp, and sorry, I'm a New Yorker, and so forgive me if I say soft. Soft, crisp, smoky, bright, bitter. Soft can be vision, it can be hearing, it can be touch. Crisp, same thing. You can have a crisp outline of one object against another. You can have crisp sounds. You can have crisp food in your mouth, and so on with these other adjectives that I'm pointing at. You can probably think of a bunch of words yourself that evoke more than one sense. Here's an example of Flaubert. Giving us 4 senses in one sentence from Un Cœur Simple. Sense of summer, buzzing of flies, glittering sun, and warming slates. You can almost feel the warmth of that summer against your body as you read. Seamus Heaney, in a beautiful poem about his father, writes about his father digging. This is the way he remembers him. And he says, under my window, a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground. Clean rasping, you can hear the sound of his father's shovel, but he also gives you more to work with. The coarse boot on the lug, the shaft against the inside of the knee. He's trying to put you into his father's body. And then finally, he talks about the potatoes, the food that his father was enabled them to eat, the cool hardness of the potatoes in our hands. So he's putting you into the body of the father, into the body of the son who's telling the story about his father digging, so that you can imagine it. And finally, Edwidge Danticat's beautiful novel, Breath, Eyes, Memory, which I recommend highly. She opens it with a description of vision and touch of the main character. The main character is a 12-year-old girl at this point who's preparing a little card for her Aunt Ati. She flattens the drying daffodil under her hand. It's dangling off the side. So the combination of what this card looks like and what it feels like to the character allows you to zoom in and enter that character's body. That's the idea. So the reader, you identify with her because you're feeling her sensations as well as seeing what she's seeing. Okay, I guess the main thing I want to get across here is that none of this is just about literature. Using senses to communicate and to create empathy is relevant to just about every field of knowledge there is, and also just to human beings relating to each other. For a doctor, if you're a doctor, you want to make sure that your patient knows exactly what it will do to him if he continues to eat cheeseburgers, right? And so you've got to say something that's going to help him to picture his arteries. You very often need to use sensory descriptions to make passages stick in the mind, to arouse emotions that will make them memorable. And well-written literature and the craft knowledge of writers indicate that to move the emotions, you do need to use some sort of sensation. It can be any sensation. It can be an unusual combination of sensations. And very often it's several at the same time, so that you can help to, if you're telling your story, if you're telling the story of someone who socially needs more attention than she's getting or he's getting, if you're a journalist, you tell that story by trying to share the sensations and through them the emotions of the person you're describing. So thank you very much. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. And I'd like to turn it over now to Miriam Udel, who will be our third speaker.
Hi. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you to the organizers of this event and to the attendees for this opportunity to share our work. So my work lately has been about the field, really the kind of nascent subfield of Yiddish children's literature and culture. And that's what I'm going to be drawing on today for my remarks. So I want to start out by reading you an extremely brief poem, I think a 36-word poem by a Polish-Canadian Yiddish author and poet, essayist, and novelist named Ida Maza. And just as Kafka is reputed to have told the Jews of Prague, you understand more Yiddish than you think, I think that probably those attending today understand more Yiddish than you think. And so I'm going to first read the poem just in Yiddish and go on from there. And then at the end, we'll come back and I'll read it to you in my English translation. So the title of the poem is Fragepunkt, Fragepunkt, Fragepunkt. Als ich wollt sein du und du wollst sein ich, wollt ich getrogen deine Schicht. Mir wollt sein 8 Jahr und dir wollt sein 4. Wollt dann gespielt mit mir? So this is an evocation of empathy, of what it is like imagining that you could be in somebody else's shoes and that they could be in your shoes. And the reason I wanted to highlight that poem is because Yiddish children's literature as a whole is not just a kind of ambient or phenomenon that is simply around in the air. It's a project. It's a very intentional, conscious project that has to do with the cultivation of empathy. So I think it's often useful to think in terms of a contrast. So I'm going to offer what might be a more familiar contrast with the Brothers Grimm and the way that they put together their book of Hausmärchen that went through 7 editions between 1812 and 1857. They were concerned about folklore and the collection and authentic, the accurate recording of authentic folk materials from the lands that would eventually unify as Germany. And that was really their passion and their interest. And it only came about after 2 or 3 editions that they realized that they could have a superior commodity on their hands, a book that would sell more copies if they turned it into a more child-friendly book. There has long been an association between the folkloristic, folklore, folk literature, and children. It's not an exclusive bond, but there's a kind of a feeling that folklore is more accessible than the highest literature a culture is producing, and therefore is suitable for children who are less sophisticated as readers, and in that way are like the folk, if you were. At least that was the old way of thinking about it in the 19th century. And so for the Brothers Grimm, children's literature was really kind of the afterthought. Their project was about cultural nationalism. It was about defining the authentic materials of the German folk. And Yiddish develops a literature for children several decades later, really starting at the turn of the 20th century, not immediately with stories written for children, but with classic stories involving child protagonists that were originally written for adults and that were kind of revised and retrofitted through glossaries and notes and creative emendation and a lot of cutting, and we might even say Bowdlerization, to be made into children's stories. And that held sway for a couple of decades, really from 1900 until almost 1920. And then Yiddish authors, educators, started writing specifically for children as an outgrowth of the school systems that were in turn an outgrowth of Yiddish political activity. So today, we would look at the range of visions that were current at that time, and we would assign all of them to the kind of larger category of a secular Jewish left. But there were really divergent visions about what conditions, what philosophy, what approaches would create an optimal future for the Jewish people. So looking back to the 19-teens, 1920s, and 30s, that range extended from the idea that the best possible future for the Jews would be in the historical land of Israel, so the idea of Zionism, to the idea of broad global socialism with a distinctive place for Jewish identity, and that would be Bundism, or the idea that Yiddish and Jewishness were really just a kind of old legacy that the sooner it could be disposed of, the better, in favor of the global unification of the entire working class as one. And that, of course, would be communism. So no matter which ideology authors for children subscribed to, they wanted to dig down under these political commitments and find a set of underlying values that they could foreground for children. And these values often had to do with generosity, kindness, the development of class consciousness, the understanding of a social and economic order and one's place in it as a function of concerns about generosity and making sure that people have their needs met or have roughly equal shares of whatever the goods are. But all of that in turn is undergirded by a concern to foster in children a sense of empathy. And that often meant asking children to identify with a radical other. So the Soviet Yiddish poet and novelist Moshe Kulbach begins his story about the wind that got angry by asking children to do something really unusual and to identify with a character or an entity in the natural world for whom we don't usually have a lot of sympathy, and that is the wind. We meet a tired old wind who's trying to find a place to rest at the end of the winter and who has to flee from the city because spring has come early and the warm spring breezes are a threat to his very life. And so he goes from place to place, from an oak tree to a rock to a country inn, being rejected everywhere because nobody wants this cold, howling wind around. So he finally goes out to the middle of a field and he whips up a blizzard that is described so lyrically and so beautifully. And then in the second half of the story, a single mother comes out of her cottage and she begs the wind for the sake of her children to please calm down, to please stop blowing all the snow around so hard. And the wind finally agrees. And I think if we take a step back from this, we see that it's really a story about the strong, powerful feelings that lead a pre-verbal child to have a tantrum, to completely break down. And so when we read a story like that, and when we imagine the scene of a parent reading a story like that to a child, it becomes an exercise in building empathy, in building an understanding of what the world looks like from the viewpoint of somebody who's radically other. And one of the most universal yet fleeting forms of otherness is the discrepancy in people's ages, which, as we know, looms a lot larger in early childhood than it does later as we grow up. So I want to return to that Yiddish poem that I opened with by Ida Maze. That poem is question mark, question mark, question mark. And now I'm going to read to you from my translation in Honey on the Page. You were me, and I were you, I'd be in your shoes. I would be 8, and 4's what you'd be. So then, would you play with me? Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, Peter, and Laura for those wonderful presentations. The audience is encouraged to send in questions via the appropriate method, but we already have a couple, and so so I'd like to start with them. So these are ones actually for all three of you, and so you can each kind of take your turn and interpret as you'd like. The first questioner asks, do contemporary authors build empathy in the current time of crisis in the same ways as the authors who you've talked about in the past did? I guess we could just stick with the same order of the presentation. So Peter, the floor is yours.
They certainly do. You know, the range of literature that is written these days, and keep in mind, I'm a scholar of German literature, so I have now mainly German literature in mind. The range of literature that is published out there is so rich and with such a variety, be it poetry, be it plays, or be it novels. I just finished, for example, reading Olivia Wenzel's 1017 Angst. It kind of continues on the topic that I briefly addressed, meaning she is a child of mixed race. She was born in what back then was East Germany, and she now rethinks through various voices in her novels very powerfully what it meant or what it means to face, you know, either microaggression or obvious racism in society. And I cannot go into the whole plot level, it is rather complex. But I recently attended a webinar like this with her, and she said people were in tears, actually, when reading it, being for the first time an older generation aware of how much racism is also part of Germany today, or I should say Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And so the function of today's literature, and this is just one example, there are many more that is published today, has the same, to enlighten us, and as Laura has so beautifully outlined, the power, and also Miriam, the power of literature. It is one thing to cognitively say, oh, I'm against racism. Sure, I hope all of us can agree on that. But, you know, it's a whole nother level to be really become empathetic. And in the poem that we just heard, what is it if a person faces some form of discrimination based on race, and therefore very moving. So.
Laura, I think we're putting it over to you.
Yes. Yeah, I have to be brief. I have, there are several leaf blowers being used right outside my Laubbläser, right? So, it's empathy, like feel empathy for me. I agree with Peter that I think the same basic human methods are being used. You know, when I watch CNN, I can see these journalists struggling to try to convey, you know, what does it mean that 2,000 people a day in the US are dying of COVID? And they seem to be able to convey it best if they pick one person and they show the family of that person. Or if they pick maybe 5 people and they show the families of that people, they show the little daughter of those people. And the tendency to focus on one individual life for the purpose of activating readers' or listeners' memories. What you need to do is appeal to the listeners or the viewers' own experiences, you know, of a time when the person was sad, or when that person was hungry, or when that person was hurting for some reason, and to get those memories going, to make them real, you know, to reactivate them in a person's mind. You have to refer to something that usually that individual is literally feeling. Yeah,
so I agree that this is absolutely still a current phenomenon. But at the same time, I also want to highlight the extent to which, as we say, the past is a foreign country, and going back and reading some of these texts from however long ago, whether we're looking at, you know, ancient civilizations or early modern or the more recent but still past, that itself can further build our kind of empathy muscles, I think, because we're imagining ourselves into an experience that is at once so different from and yet so continuous with our own.
Thank you. Our next question actually fits in perfectly with this first one, and one of our participants writes, thank you all for the wonderful presentations. How do you each view the roles of anti-heroes in narrative? Can using an anti-hero as a protagonist still build empathy? And I propose we just stick with the same order. It's working well. So Peter,
no,
the floor is yours.
I would argue that the real specialist on this topic is actually Miriam. So I would like her to start on it because she wrote a whole monograph on this question.
Thank you, Peter. I did smile at that question because my first book was called Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque. And it talks about the picaresque form, which typically features first-person narration by a protagonist who is at the margins of society in some way. And one of the ideas that I developed throughout this book is a real contrast that I haven't actually seen articulated elsewhere before, that there's a real tension or a real contrast between the picaresque, that form I just described, and the Bildungsroman and the Bildungstradition, where we have usually a somewhat sympathetic character as our protagonist, like the one in the book that Peter translated, in The Blue Stain. And so the picaresque hero is not precisely an anti-hero, but I would describe him more as a slacker hero or an unheroic hero. He's not necessarily a bad guy, but he just doesn't have the traits that we normally assign to a really good guy or a kind of conventional hero. And so the picaresque and the Bildungsroman are two really different ways of telling a life story. And they have to do with a very different kind of imagination about life's possibilities. And what I argue in that book is that for the Jews who were writing in Yiddish during the early 20th century, a narrative whereby you come from the provinces and you come toward the metropolis in the center of the nation, however it's understood, and you take your place in society through a series of educational experiences, and it might even be the college of hard knocks, right? Some of those might be adverse experiences, but you grow and you become gebildet, and you become educated, but you also become built up as a person who can take his or her, usually his place, as a member of that society and as a full citizen. And that was not the Jewish experience in Europe. And so instead, we see an emphasis on this other kind of narrative where things just happen to you. And maybe you survive it and maybe you don't, but as long as you survive long enough to tell part of the tale, that becomes its own sort of triumph. And I think that those books do actually go a long way toward cultivating readers' empathy as we see adversity after adversity pile up and the kind of resilience of the human spirit that's often on display in those texts, even if their protagonists don't end up winning at life.
Yeah, I would now answer that question very much in contrast of the two novels that are briefly presented. With the Bettauer, The Blue Stain, it is ending and you basically want to say at the end with the protagonist, please show me where I can sign up for the civil rights movement, for the NAACP, let me know, be part of it and move heroically towards a better world. Whereas Marilyn is indeed an anti-heroine, in the sense of she, throughout, of course, in retrospect, we learn that she knew all along this will not end well, that she was hesitant to bear a child and to give birth. And in that sense, she's passive and she's a tragic figure. But in terms of speaking, how we can relate to her very, very strongly, if so to speak, through the degree of silence that character has around her and her past, her family past, and the pain that she has to go through. And in that sense, she is in an inverse way as powerful and as loud, even though it's silent, as loud of a voice for helping those that have been discriminated against.
I think one of the great things that literature and studying literature can do is encourage sympathy for characters or people for whom you might never have had sympathy before. I'm always, I'm very suspicious of the term unsympathetic character, also of the term relatable, which comes up a lot in discussions. What does that mean? That a character is unsympathetic? Is it a failure of the character? Or is it a failure of you as a reader? And so, I would hope that in reading, and talking to other people about literature, people can expand their concepts of what's relatable or what's sympathetic. And I realize I may be contradicting what I just said, because I said, you read to awaken your memories. But at the same time, through hearing about things that are outside of your experience. Hopefully you're expanding your notion of what's emotionally possible.
Thank you. We have about 8 minutes left and a few more questions. So we'll try to work through as many as possible. The next questioner is interested in senses and asks whether readers relate to particular senses more than others when they're reading a novel. And they particularly ask if there's academic scholarship that's studying this kind of reaction of readers to how they relate to words in their other ways. So again, I'll let you all choose who wants to go first.
Okay, it sounds like maybe I should start with this one. So there is some very good scholarship happening on this, and maybe, let's see, while others are talking, am I able to type names into the chat and so that all the participants can see them? Can I adjust things to everyone, or just the pen? No. Okay, so then I will very slowly say the names. Elaine Scarry, Dreaming by the Book. It's a wonderful book about visual mental imagery that can be evoked by reading. Gabrielle Starr, S-T-A-R-R, has a book, Feeling Beauty, about how many different senses can be evoked at once. And Elaine Oyoung, A-U, and then Y-O-U-N-G, has a book called When Fiction Feels Real, about tricks that writers use to make things feel real. So the question of what senses are evoked by literature, it's going to depend on the reader and on the writer. I'm currently teaching a course as a first-year seminar on literature and the senses. And one of the things I always ask students on the first day of class is, do you have a favorite sense? Do you think from your experience so far in life, do you get the feeling that maybe you're a little better at one sense than another? And people do admit, there are smellers and there are hearers. Sometimes the hearers are musicians, sometimes the smellers are cooks, but really anything can happen. So there are going to be readers who are more sensitive to certain kinds of descriptions and remember them better, but there are also writers who are better at doing certain kinds of description. For an example of a character that you might not have ever thought you would sympathize with is Grenouille in Das Parfum of Patrick Süskind. This is the novel Perfume, who is a serial killer who has killed a couple dozen young women and done very bad things with their bodies to extract their scents. So you would not think that you might sympathize with this character, but there are moments when you're almost kind of rooting for him, and just in his struggle to survive. And then you say, wait a minute, what am I doing? But Süskind, I think the reason that novel was a world success is that he's brilliant at describing smells and using language to help people imagine smells, even if that's not their best sense. So it's going to depend on the reader and on the writer, how well language can evoke sensory experience.
Yeah, I would pick up on the last sentence that Laura just mentioned. I would argue very much strongly that it is every reader, there is not the reader. Every one of us brings different experiences to reading, chooses different books, novels, plays, poems to read. And so it's a multifaceted from both sides, from the literature's point of view, but also from the reader's point of view. What age are you reading? What mood are you in? Am I in a mood now to, just have a quick read, or do I want to immerse myself into the world of War and Peace by Tolstoy, which is a kind of a pre-Netflix novel, so to speak, So it is really, I would argue, it depends on so many factors what it is that all of a sudden triggers particular senses in you, either memory, a certain smell, a certain sound, a visual image, and so on. So it's very difficult to generalize an answer, I would argue. But once again, Laura is much more an expert on that than me.
And because I am not particularly expert on that, I want to shift the question a little bit toward the idea of the sensory import of the reading experience beyond the text. So the reason that I called my anthology of Yiddish children's literature Honey on the Page is that it evokes an old custom of starting a child's education by smearing honey on the alphabet primer that was given to them on the first day of school. And the idea is that they lick up the honey and it makes all subsequent learning sweet. And so the experience of reading is embedded in an entire sensory framework, and that can be quite elaborate, right? We have passages where Walter Benjamin is writing about his childhood reading experiences, and he evokes the snow of reading and the feeling of watching it snow outside in this well-furnished, well-appointed, very comfortable apartment where all of the furniture is too big for him because he's a little boy, but it's quite nice. And it's a certain kind of burnished memory that goes along with reading. Obviously, not every child who's reading is in that kind of enviable circumstance, but I think it's really useful to think about the senses and the sensory with that larger experience, as Peter was saying, of the whole context of how we read.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of slightly modify the final question because we have such a short time and you'll each just have a quick answer. The question is about how each of you do your research, but perhaps to link it to the previous question, you could tell us which sense is most important for each of you when you're doing your research. And with that, we'll be able to close. Miriam, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, mine is easy and short. The most important sense for my research is touch, because I do my best at thinking about actual new ideas in the shower.
For me, the most important part about research is really to discover something of connections that have been not made before. As I brought up these novels, for example, no one has looked at the Das Blaue Mal for over 100 years. So to rediscover was wonderful. And in terms of senses, for me, I'm a gemütliche person. I need a surrounding that is nice and conducive to fully immerse myself in reading and looking up things, and that's to me important.
Okay, this has to be brief, so I'd say with me, no question about it, it's hearing. My whole consciousness is organized around sound and voices, and I hear my ideas when they come to me.
With that, I'd like to thank our three wonderful panelists for the presentations today. In the name of the Halle Institute, thank you all. And I'd now like to turn the event back over to my wonderful colleague, Katie Bush.
Wow, thank you all so much. I just finished a book this week about a bank robber who I strangely had a great deal of sympathy for. And this discussion gave me an even greater appreciation for that novel. So thank you all for that. And again, thank you, Peter, Laura, and Miriam for your fascinating presentations and discussion and about storytelling. And thank you, Jeff, for wonderfully moderating again, my partner here in these programs, for wonderfully moderating today's program. I want to give another reminder that this presentation was recorded and will be available for future viewing on the Emory Collective and YouTube. So if you enjoyed it so much you want to watch it again, please check those out or share them with your friends and family. I also want to thank our wonderful volunteer leaders in Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. These dedicated alumni work tirelessly to provide programming for the Emory community abroad. If you live abroad and are interested in future engagement, please learn more and access contact information for our international volunteers at alumni.emory.edu. Please also look out for virtual programs hosted by my office, the Office of International Advancement and Constituent Engagement, at engage.emory.edu/international programs. I want to thank you all again so much for joining us. I wish everyone happy holidays, good health, and safety in the year ahead. Take care.